Welcome back, everyone. This is Dr. Gallenstein, and today we are going to start a series of lectures on equilibrium and efficiency. So far in the class, we've talked about, equilibrium and efficiency. So far in the class, we've talked about the individual agents in an economy. We've talked about consumers, and we've talked about producers, and how consumers and producers make decisions. Consumers make decisions through, let's write it this way, through maximizing their utility. Producers make decisions by maximizing their profits. Now, of course, also, they could also minimize their expenditures. Okay, so now we know from those discussions, we know how rational agents, how rational consumers make decisions. They make choices so as to maximize their utility. The whole idea there is that basically the economist's understanding of rationality is that people do what they want. Maximizing utility means that they choose the thing that gives them the most value. Producers, who are a rational producer, they will maximize profits. They will choose the thing that gives their firm the most profits. All right, so this is what individual rational agents will do. Now the question in this section of the course is to begin thinking about what happens in an economy filled with rational agents. What happens in an economy of rational agents? What happens when rational agents interact with each other? All right, and so what we're going to talk about today is we're going to get into the concept of a market equilibrium, and we're going to discuss notions of efficiency. So when do rational agents that are interacting with each other in an economy achieve efficient outcomes? Okay, so with that said, let's do kind of a brief review and definition of some concepts. So an equilibrium is basically when an economy, when a group of rational agents have traded or made economic exchanges to the point where all possible exchanges have been made. So basically an equilibrium is when trading ceases. So an equilibrium is when trading ceases, all trades or economic exchanges have been made. An equilibrium will be characterized by, we might say something like this: an equilibrium is characterized by the goods that consumers will consume, like the quantity of goods that they'll consume, and the prices at which those goods are traded at the equilibrium. So an equilibrium will be characterized by how goods and services in the economy will be distributed, and the prices at which those goods and services are sold. We will look at this more later to make this more clear. Basically, an equilibrium is when all trade ceases, all the trades in the economy or economic exchanges have been made. Okay. Now, then what we're going to talk about is, when is an equilibrium efficient? So what would characterize an efficient equilibrium? Or what makes economic exchanges between rational agents efficient? Well, for us to know this, we have to have some idea, some notion of efficiency. We have to be able to say, we have to have some measure of what we call social welfare. We have to have some measure, some way of measuring how the exchanges between different agents move us towards social welfare. We have to have some measurement of social welfare. Now, a common notion, and basically kind of a benign notion of social welfare, is the concept called Pareto. Sometimes we might call it Pareto efficiency or Pareto optimality. Okay. Pareto optimality. So let's define what this is. Pareto optimality is this. A Pareto optimal is a situation in which no agent can be made better off without making another agent worse off. This is a standard and rather benign notion of social welfare. So basically, we were going to assume this. We're going to assume that a society reaches a Pareto optimal point when they're in a situation in which we cannot make any agent better off without making someone else worse off. Okay, and so that's a Pareto optimal. Pareto optimal is a situation in which no agent can be made better off without making another agent worse off. And that might get us into a situation where we might talk about Pareto improvements. Pareto improvement would be some economic exchange that makes at least one of the agents in that exchange better off without making the other one worse off. Okay, so if I go into the grocery store and I buy a loaf of bread, the question is, will that exchange be a Pareto improving? And by that I mean, does that exchange, when I buy that loaf of bread, does it make me better off without making anyone else worse off? Or does it make the grocery store, better off without making anyone else worse off? Okay, and so if an exchange makes at least one agent better off without making the other agent worse off, it would be a Pareto improvement. And in an economy, if the economy can reach a point where no agent can be made better off without having to make someone else worse off, that would be a Pareto optimal. Now, Pareto optimality is the economist's baseline standard for what qualifies as efficient. So from a social welfare perspective, a Pareto optimal is efficient. It's efficient because no one can be made better off without making someone else worse off. And so if we combine these two concepts, we get an economist's understanding of what would be an efficient equilibrium. So let's remember, an equilibrium is when an economy has undergone exchanges and trades and production and consumption decisions until the point where all the trades and decisions have been made. The question is, when is an equilibrium efficient? An efficient equilibrium is an equilibrium. An efficient equilibrium is an equilibrium that is a Pareto optimal. So that would be if the market trades to the point where it wouldn't be possible to make anyone in the economy better off without making other people in the economy worse off, then we have an efficient equilibrium. Okay, so with that said, let's have a little bit of a discussion as to whether or not we think that a market economy would ever achieve something like a Pareto optimal. Would it be possible for a market to ever achieve a situation where you can't make someone better off without making someone else worse off? Could we ever achieve an efficient equilibrium? Well, in this context, or in response to this question, I will illustrate the idea of voluntary trades. Okay, so in a free economy, or a free market, and by free I mean no coercion. So in an economy where no one's actions or behaviors are forced upon them, that is, they're able to freely make decisions as they choose, freely make economic exchanges as they choose. So in a market without coercion, where all decisions are made voluntarily, agents will enter into voluntary trades or voluntary economic exchanges. And when they do so, they will be making Pareto optimal or Pareto improving decisions. Let's illustrate that. Why would that be the case? Imagine that we have two people. All right, we have a consumer. So let's say, imagine we have two agents. We have a consumer. Okay, and then we have a business. It's kind of like what I mentioned a minute ago with the grocery store. And then let's say that this business, I don't like how my picture looks. All right, so we have a business. And let's say, okay, let's just go back to my old example. All right, so this is a grocery store. The consumer can go into the grocery store and they can come back out with a loaf of bread. All right, so this is bread and it's in a bag. Let's say it's just a loaf of bread. Okay. Now the question is, when the consumer went into the grocery store and they gave the grocery store the money for the bread and they left with the bread, was that a Pareto improvement? Well, let's think about it. We know that we know that consumers are rational agents. That means we know that they make decisions to maximize their utility. We know that grocery stores are rational agents. They make decisions to maximize profits. Now, if a rational agent maximizes their utility, it means they make decisions to maximize their utility. Would a rational agent ever buy a loaf of bread if buying the loaf of bread gives them less utility than not buying the loaf of bread? Well, utility maximizing agent would never make a decision that would give them less utility than the alternative. That means that when this consumer bought this loaf of bread, they must put a higher value. They must put a higher value on the loaf of bread. This consumer must put higher value on this loaf of bread than they do on the money that they spent to buy the bread. Now let's put this into marginal analysis. This might help us to understand. The consumer, before they go to the grocery store, they might not have any bread, which means the marginal utility of that first loaf of bread is going to be pretty high. It's going to be pretty large. I might represent that with an upward arrow. They're going to have a very high marginal utility for that first loaf of bread. That means they're going to put a high value on that loaf of bread. Now, the grocery store, it has lots of loaves of bread. It puts a higher value on the money that it gets for the loaf of bread than it does on the loaf of bread itself. The grocery store would rather have the money than it would that loaf of bread. And so when the consumer goes into the grocery store and buys the loaf of bread, the consumer is being made better off because they put more value. They put a higher value on the bread than they do the money. And the grocery store is being made better off because they put a higher value on the money than they do the bread, in which case the consumer is happy and the grocery store is happy. This is a Pareto improving trade. Both agents are made better off. It satisfies Pareto improvement because one agent is being made better off without the other agent being made worse off. Okay, so this is an example of a voluntary trade. Now the question is, would the consumer buy the loaf of bread if the consumer put less value on the bread? Well, as long as the trades are voluntary, as long as people are able to choose, the consumer would not buy the loaf of bread if they put less value on the loaf of bread than they did on the money. Only if there was coercion would the agent enter this exchange. Only with coercion would a consumer enter an exchange in which they would be made worse off. If a consumer is uncoerced, that is, their behavior is not forced, then they will not enter an exchange that makes them worse off. Therefore, voluntary trades between rational agents are Pareto improving. Voluntary trades between rational agents is Pareto improving. And so if we have an economy, if we have a free economy with no coercion, then we have an economy filled with consumers and producers making voluntary trades. And if those agents are rational, they're only making trades that improve utility and profits. And therefore, all of the trades will be in Pareto improving. If all the trades are Pareto improving, then when the market reaches equilibrium, that means when all of the trading is ceased, when it reaches equilibrium, that equilibrium will be efficient. It will be a Pareto optimal. That means no one can be made better off without making someone else worse off. Now, why would it be Pareto optimal? Because at the equilibrium, all the trading has ceased. If there were any trades that would make one agent better off without making another agent worse off, then those trades would take place. And at which point, the market wouldn't have been in an equilibrium until the trades take place, and then the market would enter an equilibrium. And again, that market would be Pareto optimal. So here's the idea. The market is filled with agents, consumers and producers. As long as they're free, they will enter into voluntary exchanges amongst themselves. Every one of those voluntary exchanges will be Pareto improving, that in the sense that every single one of those exchanges will make at least one of the agents better off without making another one worse off. The economy will proceed, making exchange after exchange after exchange, until all the possible Pareto improving exchanges have been made. When there are no Pareto improving exchanges left, there are no voluntary trades left, then the trading will cease and we will have reached an equilibrium. And that equilibrium will be efficient because it is Pareto optimal. The key insight from this discussion is that the free market, filled with voluntary exchanges, without coercion, I like my picture, I'm going to leave it, that the free market, without coercion, the free market will lead to an efficient equilibrium, an efficient outcome. It will be efficient because it will be Pareto optimal. It will be Pareto optimal because in a free market, people make free and voluntary exchanges, and rational agents do not make voluntary exchanges that would make them worse off. Okay, that's a brief conceptual overview of the issue of equilibrium and efficiency. That's a brief conceptual overview of what happens in an economy that's filled with rational agents making rational decisions. I'll conclude this lecture for now, and in the next lecture, I'll begin to make this a little bit more formal by drawing some graphs and illustrating these concepts graphically. In the lecture after that, I'll illustrate the concepts mathematically, and we'll solve some practice problems. Okay, I'll see you next time.